A very warm welcome to this session on the impact of Brexit on global mobility. My name is Miriam-Anthony Ewington and I'm the Head of Client Services at Expat Academy. I'm delighted to be introducing this session from one of our Club 100 and Symposium Network sponsors, Sterling Lexicon. I know we've got a packed session, so without further ado, I'll hand straight over to Stuart Jackson of Sterling Lexicon.
Thanks, Miri, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest Sterling Lexicon webinar, in which we'll be taking a look at Brexit. My name is Stuart Jackson, and I'm an account director and member of the Sterling Lexicon Thought Leadership team, and I'll be your host for this event. Before we get started, I'd like to advise you that this event is being recorded. If you'd like to submit a question to one of our speakers today, please utilise the chat function to submit. We'll do our best to answer any questions as we go along, but as we've got a packed agenda today, we may not get to all of them. We will, of course, follow up any unanswered questions after the webinar. The UK first applied to join the European Economic Community, the forerunner to the European Union, in 1961. This application was vetoed by the French government in 1963, and the second application was vetoed again by the French in 1967. The UK eventually joined the European Economic Community on the 1st of January 1973, to then hold a referendum just 2 years later in June 1975. On that occasion, the UK voted to retain its membership, only to then reverse this decision some 41 years later, voting to leave the world's largest trading bloc by a margin of just 3.78%. The UK left the EU on the 31st of January 2020 and entered into a transition period which ended on the 31st of December 2020 with a trade agreement in place. Well, just about. Much has been written about the negative impact Brexit would have on UK and European businesses and its citizens. So today, almost 3 months into a new chapter in the UK's relationship with the European Union, we've brought together some of the sharpest minds in global mobility to examine what has actually happened and what the key things to take note of are as relates to our industry. If we can move on to the next slide, I'll show you our agenda for this session. First, we'll be taking a look at the immigration landscape with Sterling Lexicon's Head of Immigration Services, Leanne Cottrell. Next, our Household Goods Director, Rob Lucas, will review the impact of Brexit on international shipping. My colleague, Christian Franz, will give us a brief update on the impact that Brexit has had on the German financial centre of Frankfurt. And last, but by no means least, I'm delighted to be joined today by Abby Moran, International Mobility Lead at NatWest Bank, and Shirley Maxwell, Head of Mobility at Nomura, to give a corporate perspective on Brexit. Our panelists are just coming up on screen now for you on the following slides. And again, please. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Leanne Cottrell, who's going to walk us through the immigration landscape in a post-Brexit world. Leanne.
Thank you, Stuart, and welcome everyone. So ultimately, we are 3 months in. Realistically, it has caused some issues, but I think we need to be thankful that actually these issues are nowhere near as severe as ultimately what they could have been, and I think ultimately what a lot of us were projecting them to be. But I guess it's one thing that we've actually got to thank COVID for, so it does have some benefits there. Now, I think it's fair to say that most people appreciated and were well aware of the facts, you know, the changes that were going to be made to work authorization, the requirement for work permits and so on. And we've even seen some positive changes that have arisen because of this. But fundamentally, the most issues certainly that have been encountered so far are to our business traveller populations. Now, just to realistically recap where we are. So the UK launched the new immigration system on the 1st of January 2021. I think most of us would agree that actually it's a fairly generous system. And certainly, as I say, it has some positives there. So the biggest one to most is the fact that the labour market test has been removed. Now, I know that this was to massive fanfare to pretty much anyone that's ever had to navigate it before. And this certainly has made the process far more efficient and far easier to navigate. One thing to be quite cautious of, and quite frankly, I'm always cautious when it does come to the UK Home Office, is that the new system was drafted pre-COVID. And the reality is that as a result of the pandemic, most governments have adopted quite protectionist attitudes towards their immigration systems and are ultimately implementing measures to fundamentally protect the resident workforce. Now, of course, the UK has done, quite frankly, the opposite by the removal of the labour market test requirements. So it'll be interesting to see whether that stance still remains as unemployment rates rise. Now, as I say, the actual system itself is fairly generous in the criteria. We've seen a massive lowering of skill levels, which fundamentally means that the list of roles that you can award visas for has grown substantially. Now, because of this, we were anticipating some issues with things such as processing times or restricted resources from a Home Office perspective. And realistically, there haven't actually been many so far. There are certainly a few application types that, yes, there are delays being experienced on, but in the grand scheme of things, there isn't hugely many issues that's causing. Now, a couple of points just to sort of tag on to that, though, is when the new system was announced, there's a category that was brought in called the skilled worker category, and most people jumped at the chance to utilise this one. In fact, it has got a low skill level in comparison to other categories. And as I say, with the removal of the labour market test, it is an easy category to navigate. Now, this desire has actually caught a couple of individuals out. One thing to consider is that the composition of an individual salary package may well mean that actually the skilled worker route is not suitable to use, in that you can only consider base salaries, as opposed to the intercompany route whereby you can use base, you can look at allowances as well. So that has caused some issues, albeit I think it's one that once you're aware of those restrictions, it's certainly easier to navigate moving forward. The other issue that is starting to become a bit more common with the new system is fundamentally the skilled worker route requires an individual to meet an English language requirement. Now, to meet the English language requirement, the individual either needs to be a national of a recognised English-speaking country, they need to possess a qualification or an appropriate qualification that's recognised as being taught in English, or they need to pass an approved English test. Now, for most EU nationals, realistically, they won't possess an appropriate qualification that's recognised as taught in English. And of course, they're not from countries that are seen as English speaking. So they will be required to take a test. Now, for most, certainly with the individuals that we work with, they don't tend to have difficulties in actually passing the test itself, but the practicalities surrounding it are causing issues. So there are delays in securing tests in some locations, and then once an appointment has been secured for that test, you then have to wait for the results to come through. So whilst from a systems perspective, actually things seem to be moving very well at the moment, there are some wider practicalities that may well cause issues. Now, much like with workers, any visitors to the UK are also governed by domestic law. I don't really want to dwell on this too much, but fundamentally those visitors still gain entry at the port of arrival. Their stays are limited to 6 months, and they must not be frequent or successive in nature. Now, the frequent and successive point has been a requirement of our immigration system for oh goodness, quite a period of time now. And realistically, it's never caused too many issues to travellers because practicalities and geographic boundaries meant that actually visits didn't tend to be too frequent or successive because people had considerable distances to travel for those visits. Of course, now with travellers from the continent, the travel times are a lot lower. And so it's likely that travellers from the EU may well start to fall foul of the frequent and successive requirements. So that's something to be very mindful of. The activities that can be conducted during a visit can also fall foul, or you can fall foul of. So they don't permit work. Now, realistically, as I say, the main issues that are being encountered are to business travellers. And so it is historically common for EU nationals in particular to travel to the UK to fulfil contract obligations, particularly in industries such as construction and manufacturing. And prior to the UK leaving the EU, realistically, they could do that with very little administration. The UK was one of the very few states within the EU that didn't require mandatory registrations or anything like that. So historically, there's a huge amount of freedom for those individuals coming. Now, of course, the restrictions of the permitted activities of a visitor category has now meant that those individuals can no longer come to the UK for their short, sharp visits to fulfill those contractual obligations that they used to do. Realistically, British nationals going into the EU, much like with EU nationals coming into the UK, there hasn't been a huge amount of issues so far, or certainly touch wood anyway. Again, much like with EUs coming into the UK, most foresaw the requirement to have work permits issued. They foresaw the delays and the additional costs that may well be incurred as part of that process. So it really is the visitors, again, that are causing issues to those that tended to mobilise individuals to the EU. So to recap on where we are from an EU perspective, most countries within the EU have a fairly long-winded application process for a work permit. Typically, there is a degree of document preparation that's required to start. So that's normally things such as legalising a document or translating it. Now, that piece in itself can cause major issues, just simply because of the time it can take. And of course, with the pandemic as it is, there are various delays on various components of those processes. So that in itself can cause some timing issues. Once the document preparation is completed, typically a base permit needs to be awarded. Dependent on the country, the individual may well then have to submit a consular application in their country of residence, and they can then typically travel to the EU member state, but will have to secure their residency by completing some form of registration or residence permit obtainment. So typically the process of a UK national going into the EU is considerably longer than what it has been previously. But as I say, there's a general rule. Most were aware of those requirements, so it hasn't particularly caused too many issues as such. The visitors, British nationals travelling in as visitors, as I say, it really is what's causing the issues. So most of the EU is a member of the Schengen Agreement. Now, the Schengen Agreement essentially outlines some broad principles. So it will broadly confirm the activities that the agreement governs. It broadly confirms the requirements on how to navigate it. But it is up to each individual member state to apply those requirements as they see fit, of course, within the overarching terms of the agreement. So there are some variances here. But in the main, realistically, the Schengen Agreement allows someone to be within the Schengen area for a 90-day period out of any rolling 180-day period. Now, realistically, that's 90 days for the actual area as a whole, as opposed to each member state. And this one thing is really, really causing major issues. So for those that typically go and fulfill short-term assignments in a particular member state, they may well find that the early part of that assignment actually can be completed without too many issues, but then any subsequent travel is limited. Now, the Schengen Agreement allows for limited business activities to be conducted whilst the individual is within the Schengen area. So again, whilst there are some local variances, they tend to be the more hands-off observational type activities that are permitted. Some of you may well have heard of the ETIAS agreement. So the ETIAS is basically an electronic travel authorization system that has been delayed significantly so far. It's currently proposed that it will come into effect by the end of 2022, and that will ultimately govern the entry to the Schengen area. So from that point on, an individual will have to register their desire to travel to the Schengen area in advance, and this will tightly monitor the number of days that an individual actually spends within the area. So whilst absolutely I'd strongly recommend that people abide by the timing requirements now, when the ETIAS is actually introduced, then there'll of course be much tighter governance to that. Now, as I said, realistically, it is the travellers that are causing most issues. And one such example I just wanted to highlight to you is that we are finding that this lack of awareness that travellers will have different requirements applied to them is actually having significant issues, significant issues to those that are in client relationships or have some kind of contractual obligation to deliver a service. So I actually had a conversation with someone literally only a few days ago, and they are fundamentally a UK-based operation. Over the last few years, they have widened their operation within some EU states. And so they typically use British nationals to go and fulfill the obligations that they have, simply because their business generates from the UK, and this is where most of their staff are based. Now, since Brexit, they've continued to send in their individuals, much like they have done before. And of course, they very quickly discovered that the individuals don't have the right to complete the work tasks that they're conducting, and are also very soon going to be exceeding the permitted number of days that they're allowed within the Schengen area. Now, realistically, this is obviously causing massive issues for this organisation. They don't have the legal structure in place to enable them to actually support work permits in the respective EU states moving forward. So they're going to be having some very, very difficult conversations with the clients that their contracts are with. But the reason that I'm highlighting this example to you is because not only is it an example of how future issues may well be encountered because of the UK leaving the EU, but also how previous non-conformities may also cause some issues. So because the principle of free movement essentially meant that individuals had the right to mobilise throughout the EU, there was very little governance typically for these travellers. Now, for most EU member states, there is an obligation, if someone's stay is going to go beyond 90 days, that they register. Now, fundamentally, this organisation did not register their British nationals that they had in those member states prior to the UK leaving the EU. Had they done so, they realistically could have leveraged that registration to give those individuals protection under the trade agreements moving forwards. So fundamentally, they've got a situation where not only can they operate compliantly with ease moving forward, but also because of historic non-conformities, they've also jeopardised some potential mechanisms for them. So it is something to be very, very mindful of. Now, I appreciate the time, we are rapidly running out, but before I hand back to Stuart, I just wanted to cover off realistically what seems to be quite a buzzword at the moment. So because the systems are ultimately now governed by domestic law, and that in itself causes some issues with things such as entity setup and so on, people are of course looking for other mechanisms to have individuals gain work rights within EU member states and of course within the UK. Now, frontier worker is a term that's existed for quite a period of time, but it wasn't particularly fashionable, I don't think, until the UK left the EU. But it's essentially a worker that falls within a typical commuter type pattern. So from an EU definition viewpoint, they should be returning to their base country at least once a week, but fundamentally they have a base in one country and they travel to work routinely in another country. Now, different countries have different ways to administer their frontier schemes. They have different definitions. Most of them will require the individual to have worked within a country within the 12 months prior to Brexit happening, and then to keep travelling into that country at least every 12 months from their latest trip. Realistically though, if you have got an individual that fits within this pattern, then the frontier worker could be something that is of major benefit to you. Now, realistically, it won't allow an individual to actually make a country their base. It won't allow them to settle there, but fundamentally, it will give them work rights for a period of time. So it may well be a useful mechanism to protect those work rights until you establish a legal entity, or until you establish a greater presence, or quite frankly, until you have a greater need for someone to actually be physically based there. So all in all, we have been really fortunate, I think, in terms of the challenges that have arisen over the last few months. As I say, they could have been much more severe, but in the grand scheme of things, they really haven't been as bad as what they could have been. But I think it's very wise for us to be aware that once the pandemic starts to become under control, once travel starts to increase, it may well be that we encounter much more issues then as a result of Brexit than we have done historically. So be a little cautious, but certainly so far it's nowhere near as bad as what it could have been. Back to you, Stuart.
Great, thanks very much, Leanne. That's really interesting, and obviously a bit of a complex scenario on the immigration front, but thanks for the update, really appreciate it. Okay, moving on with our agenda then. Next, we're going to have a look at the impact of Brexit on international household goods shipping, and I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Rob Lucas, our household goods director. So Rob, it's difficult to disentangle the dual effects of Brexit and the COVID pandemic at the moment, because in many ways they've had a bit of a cumulative effect on international shipping. Having said that, I think there are a number of changes and impacts directly linked to Brexit. First of all, do you want to start off by talking us about how Sterling Lexicon initially prepared for Brexit?
Yes, thanks, Stuart. I suppose most of last year leading into the handover really was around trying to understand what the new regulations would look like, and to really see it from the goods leaving the UK into Europe, and then the goods arriving from Europe into the UK. And I think there was an understanding, or an understanding that it would be determined by how you entered into Europe, whether you travelled from the UK to France or UK to Holland. But as the months went on, it was clearer that actually each country would determine how they would handle imports from the UK. So it was a changing dynamic. I mean, we supported a lot of organisations in terms of their moves, their group moves in preparation for Brexit. So companies redeploying their staff into Europe, and in reverse, also companies in Europe redeploying staff back into the UK. We saw towards the end of the year a spike, a pickup of activity. I think there was businesses that were trying to, beat the system, get towards the end of the year. So we saw a level of activity there. Of course, we had the COVID situation, so that didn't really help matters. And we spent a lot of time sort of registering with different authorities, different agencies in preparation for the new ways of handling shipments to and from the UK after we've left.
Great, thanks for that. So if you can, Rob, could you walk us through sort of what a move, say, from London to Paris would have looked like before Brexit, and what that looks like now, and what the additional complications of moving goods from the UK to the European Union and vice versa actually look like right now?
Yeah, certainly, thanks. So pre-Brexit, a move from, say, London to Paris was relatively straightforward. I will give you a sort of time frame. We would arrive at, obviously, the residence, prepare and pack the items to be moved. When we are ready, then we would depart the house. We could, pack and leave on a Monday, travel to the appropriate departure port, and arrive in France, travel to the new residence in Paris, and freely deliver, unpack, and set up the client's goods. The The paperwork required would merely be a packing list, a detailed list of the items to be moved from one house to the other, and that was really it. So you could leave on a Monday, deliver in Paris on a Tuesday, and return to the UK, or collect shipments to return to the UK Wednesday onwards. Really, relatively straightforward. And the only issue was the distance. Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Madrid. It pretty much followed the same procedure. Now, in the new ways of working, so there's a lot more paperwork. A lot of paperwork needs to be prepared in advance. So there's a lot more communication with the assignee's employer in terms of what is required. So once the crew have commenced the packing and loading and are ready to leave, they need to send in advance to the port broker, a pre-authorized port broker, the number of pieces and certain criteria around the vehicle that's traveling, etc. In order to control the amount of trucks entering the area where the ports mainly are, which is in Kent, we also have to apply for a permit to travel towards the port. So we've got to apply for a permit. We've sent the information in advance to a port broker, and we've also need to have a COVID test for the drivers and anyone that's traveling in that vehicle. We then go and wait and travel to a large sort of holding area with multiple vehicles, multiple cargoes, and we remain in that area, awaiting confirmation that we can now we're clear to leave the UK. Time frame, anything from 24 to 72 hours in order to do that part of the process. Simultaneously, we're lodging the paperwork in the destination country or city. Initially, we thought you'd be lodging the paperwork in where you plan to enter into Europe, but the countries wanted to ensure that they received any taxes that were due, that were applicable. So the countries, so if we're traveling to Germany, we need to lodge the paperwork for Germany, France, etc. So it's not where you enter the Europe, it's where the goods are destined for. So the similar process starts with the receiving country or the receiving city, and we remain in this holding pen until we received both green lights, leaving the UK, arriving into the country. Once we've received both green lights, we then are free to travel to the ferry or train, board the ferry or train. And then the current dynamic, which I don't think is going to work long term, we then need to travel to the port authority or the customs broker in the city that has prepared the clearance. So, for example, in Paris, the customs broker is currently in the south of Paris, and the delivery may be in the north of Paris. So you may have lost half a day traveling there to get the shipment cleared. These customs brokers are bombarded with new business and new customers, so they're not actively looking for new customers. So the likelihood is there will be more custom points, but they're just dealing with the capacity challenge at the moment. Once we've gone and collected, taken a lorry to a customs broker, collected some paperwork, we're then free to travel to the residence and commence the delivery and unpacking. So what you would see there is a much broader time frame, a much more fluid time frame, because we don't know when we're going to receive the green lights, and it's less predictable which day we're going to leave the UK, which day we're going to arrive in the destination country. From a paperwork perspective, depending on the country you're traveling to, you're probably more likely now to also need passport copies, a copy of the packing list, which we obviously can prepare, proof of residency for up to 12 months at your country of origin, valued inventory. Some countries want to understand the value of the goods to be moved, particularly if there's duty applicable. Some countries, a statement that you don't plan to sell your goods for up to 12 months after arrival, a letter potentially from your employer confirming your appointment in your destination country, and proof of address in your destination country as well. Just to add a bit more paperwork and bureaucracy into it. Every time we board the ferries now, we need to do a safety and security declaration in order for the ferries to for us to board the ferries. So hopefully it gives you an illustration of the change in procedure pre and post Brexit, the complexities that we need to work through, the fluid state that the process is, and how that may expand. Something that used to take 3 days may take 5, may take 7, and of course it doesn't encourage you. If you want to bring anything back, you have to do the whole process in reverse. So it's really not encouraging companies to travel to one location, reload and travel back. So yeah, a lot to work through. I think it will change. Again, things like traveling to port brokers in cities is a complex thing. I think it will change, and our role is to ensure that we're on top of what is continuing to settle down as we come into this new way of working.
Brilliant, thanks, Rob. Well, it sounds like there's a lot more administration, both on the part of Sterling Lexicon that's helping facilitate these shipments, but also on the part of the assignee and global mobility professionals. Really can just expect quite a more lengthy process, a bit more involvement from the assignee, and ultimately probably a little bit more cost layered in there as well. Great, absolutely. Fantastic. Thanks ever so much for that. I really appreciate you providing that update. What I'm going to do now is we're just going to move across to Germany and to one of my colleagues, Christian Franz, who's one of our account directors based out of Germany. And Christian's just going to give us a quick update on the landscape in Frankfurt. So Christian, Frankfurt main finance lobby group predicted on the day after the Brexit referendum in June 2016 that 10,000 jobs would shift from London to Frankfurt. However, by mid-2020, they believe that Brexit created around 3,000 extra jobs, with another 1,000 in the pipeline, which have yet to materialise because of COVID-19. According to EY's Brexit tracker, which monitors 222 firms, Frankfurt's attracted 23 companies in total, 19 of which are universal banks, investment banks or brokerages. Now, we're going to talk to Shirley Maxwell at Nomura next, who have chosen Frankfurt as a hub for their European headquarters, alongside banks, US banks such as Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, and of course Deutsche Bank has its HQ in Frankfurt. But according to some of the reports I've read, there's still a lot of bankers commuting back to London for weekends, COVID restrictions aside, and the hundreds of international school places banks reserved in the wake of the Brexit vote just haven't been taken up. So do you mind painting a picture for us of what Frankfurt looks like at the moment?
Sure, thanks, Stuart. I would like to give you some insight from what we see in Frankfurt right now and what we have done after the referendum in 2016. So after the referendum and the announcement of the potential 10,000 new jobs in Frankfurt, we more or less started immediately preparing ourselves to offer solutions for our clients, relocating employees into Frankfurt. At this point, we have been really worried about the limited availability of short-term accommodation, the situation at the German, the Frankfurt Immigration Office, and the availability of international schools in and around the Frankfurt area. After all the preparation work we have done on our side, we ended up supporting some new arrivals in 2018 and 2019, but less than what we really expected to see. And then COVID-19 hit us, and unfortunately, it got very quiet from one day to the other. Right now, as you already mentioned, Stuart, we are still facing a travel ban between UK and Germany, and people are working from home for more than a year now. So even commuting is not an option today, and the travel ban will be in place at least until tomorrow. And we'll see what will happen after that date. Coming to the actual situation in Frankfurt, to be very honest, it has not really changed to what it has been before Brexit. But I think the main reason for that is because of the COVID-19 situation. Considering that we had concerns in 2016 and after that about the availability of short-term accommodation, schooling, housing, or even office space is not critical today, but it was a big concern back in 2018. Rental prices in Germany, that was also a big discussion, but the prices are still increasing. But this is also not a Brexit-related issue, as we see that in all bigger cities in Germany in the last couple of years. Moving on, the schooling situation, that was also a big worry here in Frankfurt, has also not changed massively since Brexit. The international schools in and around Frankfurt are having more or less same demand as they have had before Brexit. For example, the most popular school is the Frankfurt International School just outside of Frankfurt, and they always have a waiting list for new arrivals, so that's not a big surprise, not in the past, not today. All other international schools like the Japanese International School or French School are not having specific waiting lists, and they have spaces available today, so no really impact on Brexit. The only challenge we still see on a daily basis is the Frankfurt Immigration Office at this point. Right now, it can take up to 2 months to get an appointment at the Immigration Office, but this is also more or less part of the pandemic. And it was also a concern in 2016 and 17, but that was because of the refugee situation back in that date. So that's basically what's going on in Frankfurt in a nutshell. So we don't see a big impact. And thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Christian. Really appreciate that update for Frankfurt. So moving on then into the final section of our webinar today, I'm delighted to welcome onto the call Abby Moran of NatWest Bank and Shirley Maxwell from Nomura. Abby and Shirley, I just want to check that we can hear you. I know that, so Abby, I can see you've popped up. I know that Shirley was having some camera difficulties.
Yeah.
Maybe you can hear us.
I'm having problems with the cameras, but can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly, Shirley. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, welcome to both of you. Thank you ever so much for joining us on the webinar here today. It's really lovely to have you on. Just to sort of kick us off, a London Stock Exchange survey in 2016 estimated that 232,000 financial services jobs could leave the UK as a result of Brexit. However, according to the EY Brexit tracker, this number at present looks closer to 7,600. So not quite the bloodbath we were potentially expecting. Now, I know that both of you have moved some roles into Amsterdam and Frankfurt respectively. So it'll be interesting, I'm sure, to understand more about the Brexit journey that you and your teams have been on since the referendum. So Abby, if I can start with you, can you just sort of talk me through a little bit about how the sort of Brexit story has unfolded for NatWest?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Stuart. So thinking back, it feels like a very long time ago, the referendum now. But at the time, our former CEO said publicly that, well, like many others, I suspect, that he was surprised at the result. And that was the general feeling within the bank. We had big contingency plans in place for either outcome of the referendum that were being worked on across the whole of the company. But what I think was so important for us as a financial organisation was passporting, and we had that as part of the European community. So whilst I'm definitely not an expert on it, essentially what that means is that banking services that we produced in the UK can be used across in Europe without the need for further regulation. and the same applies vice versa. So that effectively meant that European and British banks could operate without a boundary, without a border. But without passporting, if we wanted to continue to serve our clients and our customers and provide those banking services in the EU, we knew that we'd need to set up some kind of banking operation there. And everybody knows how long the UK-EU withdrawal agreement took to get agreed. And so there was so much uncertainty ongoing. We needed to provide some reassurance to our customers and give them that stability and certainty. So we actually started to move some roles from 2018, moving some activity from our investment banking arm, which is NatWest Markets, from London to over to Europe to increase the size of the existing presence that we had there. We already had a banking license in the Netherlands, so we were able to repurpose that to continue serving the EU customers. So Amsterdam became our EU hub, and then we also enlarged our sales offices in Frankfurt, Paris, Madrid, Milan and Stockholm as well. So yeah, not just moving people to one place.
Yeah, interesting that, that you've gone into several different locations. Thanks for that. Shirley, what about you from a Nomura perspective? I know that you've moved some people into Frankfurt. Do you want to sort of talk us a little bit about through what your Brexit journey has been like?
Yes, it's actually almost mirrors Abby. I couldn't put it better myself. Very, very similar, except that we had a lot of work to do with the regulators to set up an entity within Germany, which is our main hub in Europe. You know, just like Abby, we've got all those other, we're moving people into all those other European locations that she mentioned. You know, Paris, Milan, you know, Madrid, you know, Frankfurt, Stockholm, less Stockholm, but those are our 4 hubs. And like Abby, I feel like we've been doing this an awful long time. We started the process back in 2017, you know, in terms of, you know, going out to the regulators, getting the licenses, you know, as Abby said, to, you know, get our clients on board, you know, ensure that the clients were comfortable, you know, that we were going to be able to serve them, you know, from a new European location. And then from an in-house, from a mobility perspective, then we started to work on packages, you know, to be able to move people across and agree those, you know, those packages, getting costings, millions of costings, different scenarios, and, you know, trying to get a blanket approval in place for that. So there was a huge, it was a huge project, not just from a mobility angle, but, you know, all different aspects. I mean, the whole bank was involved in it in different ways, and I think we had external, you know, people helping out with this project. And so we, in 2018, we actually started to move our corporate team first. And again, it's nowhere on the scale that was predicted, nowhere near that. But we actually have moved quite a lot of people out to Europe. And now we are in the process this year of moving the front office staff, which is the investment banking or our wholesale team, as we call them.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. So I'm interested to just understand a little bit from you both about from a global mobility perspective. You've obviously sort of been heavily involved in working on fairly major projects around the Brexit move. Sort of what have been the sort of upsides around that from a global mobility perspective? Has it given you greater visibility within the organisation? Has it changed that? I know that people often sort of talk about how the COVID pandemic has given them greater visibility. Have you did you also see that from a Brexit perspective, Abby?
Yeah, I think we did. Due to the scale of the project, really, one of the advantages I think was that mobility had that infamous seat at the table from a fairly early stage, and I think that allowed us to really build trust with our internal stakeholders and demonstrate our expertise, and ultimately that led to us being able to deliver a pretty good experience for the colleagues that were actually moving. So yeah, I'd say it really did help our status amongst colleagues.
Yeah,
and I second that, Stuart. Before, I think mobility would be the afterthought. The talks and the work would happen, and then they'd come to us to deliver. But for Brexit, we did have that early seat at the table, and we've been involved all the way, and and we are continuing to be involved as the project actually expands out from just moving people for Brexit, and the people who are working from another country, and etc. We are still involved, and are still fairly visible, and seems to be appreciated.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Thanks for that. And then I wanted to move on and just sort of talk a little bit about, we said that some people have moved, some people haven't, and we sort of said right at the top there that perhaps a lot of people are still sort of travelling and commuting back and forth, sort of COVID restrictions permitting, and doing that kind of thing. Obviously, Leanne described some of the challenges and the limitations on business travel under the sort of post Brexit regime. Has that thrown up any challenges for you as a business? Abby, again, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think for me, immigration is going to be, well, education around immigration is going to be a priority, because there needs to be a real change of mindset, I think. For assignees, we all know that work permit costs will be significant, whether that's for a UK national going to the EU or vice versa. So there will need to be better planning, and we all need to start educating the business about this, because they will have to involve us earlier in the process. They won't be able to just start an assignment with a week or two's notice. And in the same regard, yeah, business travel, as you say, that mindset really will need to shift so that there's more planning. And I think I agree with what Leanne said at the end of her spotlight. Kind of, there needs to be an element of caution, because we still don't really know what will happen when business travel resumes. But we're at that stage now where we're trying to preempt and we're trying to be ready. So some of the questions that we're seeing are along the lines of, what kind of activities can somebody do in X country on a Schengen visa versus what can they, what do they need a work permit for? So we're looking, again, it goes back to education and how we can be really visible with the approach that somebody needs, that the traveller needs to follow. I think, tied to that, we're also looking at supporting letters and creating templates, putting them on the intranet and making them visible again, because these will be things that business travellers have never dealt with before between some of the countries. I think ultimately, though, it has really underpinned the need to have a robust business travel process in place, so that we know that before the trip is taken, we've got confidence that the traveller will be compliant with immigration. And we haven't talked about PWD as well, but Posted Workers Directive. So nobody really knows how that will land, I suppose. It's still relatively new. So that's another element I think we will all need to be mindful of and make sure that we've got a good process in place.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Abby. And Shirley, I mean, I guess it's the same question to you. Are you seeing?
Yeah,
lots of queries around what business travel might look once people can travel. And again, and I guess a lot of HRBPs and business unit leaders are probably looking for a one-size-fits-all sort of silver bullet. Can my banker go to these countries and do these activities? And maybe it's not as simple as that.
That's right. Yes, we've got the same. We've got the same concerns around business travel and making sure that everybody's aware of, what they can and can't do, as a traveller, and where and when they need a visa, and that we're working very closely with our business travel team, who manage travel to educate everybody. Apart from all the things that Abby said, that obviously we're experiencing as well, a couple of the additional concerns that we have is obviously in terms of immigration, it's just educating the business how long it takes to get visas for Europe. And I think that really takes them by surprise every time, that it's, we're talking about maybe, 3 to 4 months, to get somebody over, and just, making sure that they bear that in mind, in their planning. We've actually moved people in the middle of, the changeover, in terms of us leaving the EU. We've been moving the front office over the Christmas and New Year period, which has been a huge challenge. And in terms of a mobility perspective, most of the challenges are in terms of, families being split, the families left behind. We need to make sure that maybe they're still covered for medical. In terms of families seeing each other and being able to come, to travel backwards and forwards with all the, the pandemic restrictions, that's really been a nightmare to manage. And obviously we're trying to move people on a permanent basis, which is not very easy when they know that they have to leave their families behind. And obviously all the entry restrictions that are around COVID, I mean, they change on a daily basis. And even though, as a mobility function, we are not, these are all government guidelines and they're not immigration law. Everybody comes to us first to say, we heard something on the news, or Italy are now, not allowing people to leave, or France are not allowing you to come in, and you just feel that you need to be on top of. You're just constantly listening to the news. I've got all the some of the key government websites, pinging up every time something changes, because you're expected to know, and they come to you first. So every time somebody wants to travel, even on business travel, sometimes they come in and asking you first, even though you try to point them in the right direction. So yes, there is a lot of challenges at this very moment in time, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much for that, Shirley. Well, listen, we've got 5 minutes left, and I maybe did want to just address a couple of the questions that have popped up in the chat funnel. So in the chat function. So Abby and Shirley, thanks ever so much. Really appreciate you giving us your insights and some of the challenges that you've been having from a corporate global mobility perspective there. Thanks to you both.
You're welcome.
Looking at the questions, the first question that came in, I think, is for Leanne, if you're still there, Leanne. Can you touch on EU family reunification permits and what is required to allow the UK nationals to work in the EU where they have an EU national spouse? Specific question. Are you able to address that one at all?
Well, realistically, the specific requirements are going to depend on the exact EU member state that's in question. As a broad principle, realistically, the couple need to, the family members need to be linked in an acceptable form, so typically through marriage, potentially through civil partnership, through birth. Evidence of that relationship tends to need to be provided. Dependent on the actual country in question as well, there's typically an obligation to prove that the EU national is ultimately resident there, that they are financially able to support their spouse. and also maybe that the spouse has some local language abilities to enable them to integrate. But fundamentally, it is dependent on the particular state in question, and it can be a very complicated process. As a general rule, securing visas based on a relationship as opposed to something such as employment tends to be far more convoluted and far more intricate. But absolutely, we can certainly address that separately if we find out the specifics involved, and I can be a bit more accurate with that one.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And then it looks like we've got another immigration related one here for you, Leanne, as well. Is there anything on the horizon to cover short-term work activities for UK nationals in the EU rather than existing options for longer-term workers?
Potentially, yes. So what we're starting to see is that there are a couple of countries that actually are releasing more information on what they call work permit exempt activities. Now, fundamentally, these are still more business type activities as opposed to full work activities. But it does show that there is an appetite on the continent to enable UK nationals to be able to fulfil these short-term assignments. What's also worth bearing in mind is that realistically, the more agreements that the UK enter into, if we proceed to do so, they will typically have some kind of immigration component to those. So fundamentally, if the UK and Spain, for example, were to negotiate a separate trade agreement, then what's likely to be included within that is rights for citizens of both nationals and nationalities involved. And that will probably enable short-term work without things such as requiring a work permit. So ultimately, I think, yes, absolutely, we can expect to see something. As to when, who really knows? Realistically, this is going to tag into the more protectionist attitudes that governments have, though, because of COVID. So reality is that the governments out there are trying to protect their local workforces, and so they're not necessarily in a favourable immigration categories to third country nationals until their population stabilise and until they can get their unemployment levels realistically at an acceptable level to that country. But I think certainly over the coming months, years, then absolutely yes, we should start to see some coming through.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much for that, Leanne. That's absolutely great. I think we're coming up on the hour now, so I think those are the only questions that we're going to be able to cover today, but we will follow up with everybody who's submitted a question to us, and thank you ever so much for doing that. It only really leaves me to say thank you very much to all of our panelists here today. And a very special thank you to Abby Moran at NatWest Bank and to Shirley Maxwell at Nomura for sharing their insights with us. I very much appreciate your participation. If anybody has any questions or would like any follow-up, then I've included my email address at on the slide that you're seeing now, so please do feel free to message me if you'd like to. Otherwise, just to wrap up this session today, I'm going to hand back to Mirianthi at Expat Academy to close us out. Thanks, Miri.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much for the fantastic session, Stuart and the team. Certainly some great food for thought, especially around the upcoming challenges as business travellers start to move once again. So just a couple of things to wrap up the session. Don't forget, for those registered for my GMPD, you can gain 1 GMPD point by submitting your learning log for this session. Just head over to the Expat Academy website. Also, I just wanted to let you know that we've got our Symposium and Club 100 Network huddles next week on the 23rd and 24th of March, respectively, where you can join us, Sterling Lexicon, and our other network sponsors to discuss your current hot topics further. If you haven't already registered, please do head over to the Expat Academy website and get signed up. And if you're not an Expat Academy member and would like to guest pass, please do contact Sterling Lexicon, who can liaise with us accordingly. So thanks once again to Stuart, Leanne, Rob, Christian, Abby and Shirley for a fantastic session, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Enjoy your afternoons and your evenings.